Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Life of a Business Manager podcast. This is the podcast where we break down the real world skills every business manager needs to succeed. I'm your host, Sina Chan, and today we're doing a two-part episode series. In this part one episode, we sit down with Ramana Sastry, who is the former executive director of clinical technologies for a major healthcare organization. Ramana and I work with each other for multiple years. He's the expert when it comes to clinical technologies and is passionate about helping patient care. After years of leading large scale technology initiatives and driving innovation in clinical operations, Ramana has recently stepped into retirement and enjoying his journey. So let's take a listen. Hi, Ramana. Welcome to the podcast. How's your week going?
Hi, Sina. My week is going very, very well. We just had some guests come over from Massachusetts, my old neck of the woods, and we spent a nice, pleasant week in San Francisco with our old friends.
You didn't grow up in Massachusetts, did you? Did I miss that?
No, no. I came from Massachusetts. I spent over 10 years at Massachusetts, but I grew up all over the place. My father worked for the UN, so in a sense, I was a UN brat. I moved around a lot.
Okay, got it. Well, let's get started unless you have any new news to tell me right now.
No new news. I'm retired and I'm enjoying it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for being on the podcast. First off, so we met at work. We worked with each other for almost, I want to say over 5 years plus, right?
I think it's more than that. I think we met when we shared an office suite at 350 Parnassus. We shared an office suite, and that's how we met. And then when we moved out of that office suite, we still stayed in touch through our staff meetings, etc. And then you were working with us with regarding as a business manager for Perio
Yes, yes,
when we were
yes,
trying to take on their capital equipment responsibilities.
yes. And as you know, I will not be saying where I work, but I'm sure people will figure it out.
Right. We won't say where that is.
Yeah. So let's just get started. Let's just share your background, Ramana. If you just want to introduce yourself. So we met through work over multiple years. I was a business manager for Periop and still a business manager, but supporting other departments right now. And I've worked with you because we were going through capital acquisitions for Periop and other medical equipment. So that's how we met and now you're retired and kind of working on other ventures, ideas coming up. But let's just start with just introduce yourself, your background, and then also how did you get started as a clinical director or clinical technology director? So just correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure. My career as a clinical engineer, I sort of in healthcare, I sort of got into it backwards. I wasn't really intending on it. It was supposed to be a job, but then for as a biomedical equipment technician, number one, just to help pay bills. And I was planning on eventually going to grad school, but I decided not to go to grad school and continue my career as a biomedical equipment technician. And over the years, I moved up the ranks from a biomed one to a four, then to a clinical engineer, then to a supervisor and a manager and a director. And eventually I retired as an executive director of clinical technologies.
So I didn't know you actually started off as a biomed tech.
Yes, I did.
So you
So I
started
started
all
off
the way from the bottom of the department and then moved yourself all the way up to like executive director, right?
correct. So yeah, that was through I mean from biomed to a biomed one to a biomed one to a biomed four. It took several years, and I did that with the same hospital and the same facilities and the same company. I worked for a third party vendor at that time that provided in-house clinical engineering departments to healthcare facilities. And from that point, I just continued on there. And then to go from a supervisor, I had to switch states. And then same company, same states, but then going from a supervisor slash manager to a director, actually, I had to go to a different hospital altogether. And that was the first time when I became a director, was the first time I worked directly for a healthcare facility. Up until then, I worked for a vendor that supplied a clinical engineering department to the hospital. So and then that was back in Massachusetts. And then I moved out here, and then the rest is history, as you know.
Yes, yes. So I wanted to bring you on because first off, I don't know if anyone out there listening knows exactly what is the role of executive director for clinical technology. Originally, when I worked with you, it was clinical engineering, and then now it's clinical technology. Not that that's any big difference as far as what you support, but I wanted to bring you on so you could share exactly what you do. I don't know if you get asked exactly what you do sometimes, but it would just be useful for the audience as far as what exactly do you do? What's your daily role when you were the executive director?
So, my brother, for the last 40 years or so, he keeps asking me, what exactly do you do? And I keep explaining it to him. So I'm sure there are a lot of people out there listening to this podcast that are not quite aware of what all clinical technologies or biomed or clinical engineering does. And I think that's one of the issues right now within our field that as a career track we need to fix. So what we do is we start off with the basics. Ideally, the reason why I went from clinical engineering to clinical technologies was we were focusing on the technologies used in the delivery of healthcare. There's a lot of technologies that used in medical centers and in healthcare facilities, but we limit our purview to the technology used in the delivery of healthcare. And in that end, that's one of the reasons why I switched our name from clinical engineering to clinical technologies, because we incorporated other functions of work responsibilities for as it relates to medical devices to us to clinical technologies. And so therefore clinical engineering has a very finite and very borderline approach to managing healthcare technology. But for clinical technologies we decided to incorporate other functions that traditionally were not in clinical engineering's wheelhouse. And that we did because of the changing definitions of medical devices, from a standalone device to devices essentially that are computers that sit on a network that have a bidirectional data flow. So we handle that full spectrum. And we created one of the divisions, or one of the groups within clinical technologies, was we call systems engineering, that handles the same inventory as the biomed group does, which handles the devices from a break fix and preventative maintenance perspective. But the systems engineering team handles the same inventory, but at a systems level. They're also responsible for integrating medical devices into the EMR, and to make sure that that integration is accurate and is the proper fields are being completed and filled in. So that's a lot of responsibility that we took on, because it really didn't fall into anyone else's purview. But since it was medical device related, we took it on, and as a natural progression of the medical device definition by the FDA.
I always felt like you were building an empire, Ramana.
Well, it's not a question of empire. It's a question of, one of the things that I noticed in healthcare facilities, and especially in periods of time when resources are somewhat scarce, people will try to save their own budgets and limit their functionality in order to remain within their budgetary confinements. However, I never sort of subscribe to that thought, because at the end of the day, if it's related to healthcare and if it's related to patient care specifically, then the answer, in my opinion, cannot be no. It has to get done. We just can't pass the buck. So therefore, we took on a lot of responsibilities related to medical devices that may, in many other healthcare facilities, may be dispersed out. I think there are just a handful of large healthcare systems that have done what we have done at our location, to incorporate device integration, systems integration, cybersecurity as it relates to medical devices, all of that, and then capital acquisition. All of that was under our larger umbrella, as opposed to leaving it to someone else to decide those fates. Because at the end of the day, a full-fledged engineering provider, such as a good clinical technologies department that's well-rounded, will be able to provide services that the clinicians need at a moment's notice. And one of the biggest differences for me, and one of my colleagues had put this, and I still quote that gentleman all the time, is that the quintessential difference between IT and clinical technologies is that IT, and rightfully so, is process driven, whereas clinical technologies, by the very definition of what we do, has to be event driven. And I think there are certain processes that we do take from IT, but all the aspects of being event driven for a medical device with a patient involved has to be event driven, and we cannot necessarily wait for processes to catch up. Does that make sense?
Yes, that was my next question was what's the difference between IT and clinical technology? Part of it is because even just me from a customer perspective, right? I always got confused with that because I didn't know if we have, for example, let's just give the audience an example. So if we have a laser equipment request, right? Some of the questions that were asked was, does it connect to the network? Is this, their PHI information, all of that is involved. So I never really understood where was the gray line in between IT and clinical technology.
So at where I work, I drew the line where if comes into direct contact, if it's hardware or even software applications that come directly in contact or influence patient care, then that should be part of clinical technologies. And the gray area are those, especially in the last 5 to 6 years, are medical systems coming up through as an application as opposed to a physical device. And that's where the gray line is sort of blurred between clinical technologies and information technologies. But at the end of the day, the distinguishing feature has been up until the last few years, whether if that physical device is directly related to patient care. Physiological monitors are directly related to patient care. Surgical instrumentation is directly related to patient care. Anesthesia, for example, defibrillators, all those things like applications that actually, for example, in the EP cath lab, that's our first experience where we were noticing the difference between the gray areas between clinical technologies and IT was the aspect of having to be able to process equipment. I mean, there were some examples. Let me backtrack. The example I was trying to think of is the electrophysiological mapping. That there is a front end device, but that front end device is more or less secondary to the actual application that resides on our network. And therefore, that was a gray area between IT because it's not really a physical device, but it's really not an IT system like a laptop or a computer or a phone. It's rather it's a software application that is a medical device. So getting back to your answer, maybe the answer should be is if it's considered to be a medical device as defined by the FDA, that should be under the purview of clinical technologies.
Okay, understood. Well, let's just go there with the new technology now. So, what is your opinion on AI and the healthcare industry in regards to this, and how does clinical technology support that when it comes to AI?
So AI, I think it's interesting because what's coming up is it's a rapidly changing field, especially from a few years ago, where AI was nothing but a statistical analysis on steroids with a huge amount of data. But now we're talking about machine learning incorporated into AI, and that becomes at that point true artificial intelligence, where the feedback loop of information can provide really good summaries or as well as diagnostics for not only patients but also equipment as well. So I think where AI will come to facilitate healthcare from a clinician's point of view would be the ability to use massive amounts of data and to churn massive amounts of data a lot faster than the human brain can and provide reasonable outputs from that. However, the thing with AI is I took a training on AI before I get access to the generative AI application at the place where I was working. And one of the things that came up in that training was something called artificial intelligence psychosis. And then because it really does, because sometimes you don't know where it's pulling the data from and whether it's real or not. Because there have been instances, for example, when sort of reports that were requested from a generative AI system came up with false information. So therefore, AI can be very, very useful right now. It speeds up a lot of things, but it cannot eliminate the human aspect of review and in final interpretation for the care of that patient. From a clinical technologies perspective, right now there is a large portion of clinical technologies is what I call the biomedical equipment function, which is the day-to-day break fixes and the required compliance, preventative maintenance inspections. So the required preventative maintenance inspections, I think, can be greatly reduced. The number of labor hours can be greatly reduced if we automate a lot of that. For example, we know that what parameters that we have to measure when we're doing a preventative maintenance inspection. These machines do a lot of that self-diagnostics already. The idea is to gather that self-diagnostics, review it from the perspective of certain parameters, whether they're within the normal range or not. And if not, then it shoots off as it starts drifting, it shoots off an email or shoots off a connection to your work order database, work order system that generates a work order to tell a technician or an engineer to go look at this because it's not failed yet, but it's the ranges in which some of those parameters are are drifting and it requires some attention. So it becomes more predictive maintenance as opposed to preventative maintenance, which is, you have to go actually see it. In a lot of our systems, like in physiological monitors, it's all software based, and there are no more physical PMs really required. But historically, PMs are still required from, I guess, from a legacy perspective on these systems. For example, I can go in and do a PM on a physiological monitoring system inside a room, and then a minute or two later, it could fail. There is no guarantee that the mean time between failure will be impacted. So therefore, why bother doing those physical PMs? Let the machine decide. There are certain areas where a physical PM is required. So we're not saying that we will eliminate all of the biomedical engineering functions, labor portion, but we can greatly reduce it. However, as the technology becomes more and more in depth, we need clinical engineers who manage the systems who manage this equipment as a system, as opposed to the individual technicians that manage all the discrete devices. Though those individual technicians will be doing, I guess, less preventative maintenance work, because hopefully if AI goes down that path for medical equipment, then a lot of the preventative maintenance can be eliminated because the machine is gathering the data and you set the parameters. And if anything, any data point goes outside those parameters, they can shoots off a request to a technician to look into it.
So then would you say, I know you mentioned that AI could do some of the preventative maintenance, right? And
Mhm,
right now there's a lot of organizations, even the healthcare, but even other industries where they're looking at AI. They've already implemented where AI is taking over a lot of the jobs, correct? So
mhm.
from your standpoint, if you have a tight budget, right, and you're working with not that many people, would you be able to kind of implement AI in order to save that the preventative maintenance? Because that's amount of hours.
Right. But that has to come from the manufacturers, because we cannot implement anything that's outside the design of what the manufacturer had submitted to the FDA before they got their 10K approval. So it has to be done by the manufacturer. But it's not necessarily eliminating jobs per se. What it is, I think, for clinical technologies, there is a ceiling that we cannot break, and that is, yes, we need to basically, there are certain departments that maybe have a flex budget where they can ramp up and ramp down based upon patient throughput. But for us, that's not the same. We cannot ramp up and ramp down based upon patient throughput. If you buy the equipment, it has to be maintained. Whether you use the equipment once or 1,000 times a day, it has to be maintained. Or if you use it even once, maybe once a year, but if it's physically located in a clinical space, it has to be maintained by regulatory compliance. So therefore, we cannot necessarily ramp up and down. So what we're looking at is not necessarily eliminating positions, but getting more cost effective and more efficient by having some of that work be done automatically, so that we can focus our labor resources into areas that would be a better requirement for us, such as program implementation, reading and understanding compliance from the various regulatory agencies, as well as dealing with medical device issues that can potentially cause patient harm down the road. For example, at the last place I worked at, we used to submit a lot of different reports to the FDA based on things that we thought were iffy in terms of safety. We felt that they can either pose a safety risk to both the patient and the staff. So therefore, MedWatch reports were done. So out of a lot of the MedWatch reports, we were proud to feel that some of our MedWatch reports created, or actually forced manufacturers to make design changes to prevent those issues from in future models. So that kind of work still has to be. You just cannot eliminate labor for that. But so we're saying is, if we have a finite labor pool, instead of reducing the labor, we shift the labor work from the technician's work to more of the engineering work. Does that make sense?
Yes, so that makes sense. So with all of these technology advancement, what would you say is one of the challenges when you were supporting the departments, like for example, the departments that I was working in? What was one of the challenges or some of the challenges that you were dealing with when it came to being in that role
I
and
think it was
part of
interpreting. Yeah. Sorry. It was. I think it would be interpreting and understanding the definition of a medical device by the FDA. That has evolved over time, and I think the single biggest challenge that I think we had was the fact that when the when a medical device was defined not only as a discrete device, but the network it sits on and the bidirectional data flow. Now, the bidirectional data flow, if that's considered to be now part of the medical device, that falls under our realm. And that was the single most definition change that made us work, gave us a lot, I mean, gave us a lot to think about, put it that way. We had to sort of modify our program in order to understand that, because then we needed to be able to define the medical device, and in order to, as the medical device is not only the device but the data flow as well, and that means that systems engineering team would have to take that responsibility. The biomed team would still be working from its traditional biomed function of electrical safety, performance verification, and break fix, whereas it's the engineering functions that have grown tremendously in clinical technologies. And I think that's what is the biggest challenge that our industry is facing within the healthcare, and that is that there are a lot of new leaders who come from a lot of different regions, and clinical technologies is still not a well-defined career track or even a program, so that you can, when if you go from one hospital to another, the clinical technology programs are very similar. So that's still, and that's because of the educational purposes. Like me, most biomeds and clinical engineers get into this in sort of a backdoor way. That was not our intention to join this field as a career track, but we fell into it. Once we fell into it, then we're realizing that there are not enough educational programs out there, either at the associate's degree level, or the bachelor's level, or even the master's level. As I know, from the last I looked, there was only one or two places in this entire country that had a master's program in clinical engineering. And I think that is where the crux is. I think us clinical engineers have to do a much better job in creating and formalizing our careers, the functions that we provide services to, because it's left open to interpretation by whatever leadership that comes into a hospital. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, that makes sense, Ramana. Thank you for explaining that. So then if someone was to go into this career path, I know you had mentioned that what drew you to the healthcare industry as this role was by accident, it sounds like.
Mhm.
Did you think that you would actually stay this long in this role? And also, again, going back to my question, if someone was to go into clinical technology on a resume, what do you actually look for from even, what type of major for a bachelor's? You just mentioned that there's only, a couple schools, I think, that offers a master's. What are you actually looking for if someone was to go in this field? Because there's not that many options, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I'll be looking for is two things. At the entry level, I'm looking for basic electronic skills, digital electronic skills. But even at the basic level, I would really like to have people come in with a good understanding of human anatomy and physiology. Because without the good understanding of human anatomy and physiology, then what you're doing will not make sense, and you're doing things only because it says so in a procedure. And that is not always a good way to do things. For example, there was one hospital that I worked at, whereas when I first joined there, I was just talking to all the staff, and I realized one of the things that none of them knew what they were doing when they were doing an electrical safety test. They did not, they just, when I asked them what that was, they just said they plug in the device into a safety analyzer, and then they rattled off a certain number of parameters, how many microamps would be is acceptable for leakage current exactly, but they couldn't explain to me what leakage current was. So that's where the falling into this career backwards can be detrimental without formal education and training. We try to educate people again as fast as possible. Education, like anything else, costs money, and we fall prey to the budgetary constraints, and we try to do as much internal education as possible. But sometimes internal education, while good, does not replace formal trained education at the university or the college level.
So then you said someone would have to actually be interested in the medical field then, it sounds like,
Right.
and also have some sort of informational systems background or interest in that sort.
Correct. And nowadays, I would also be looking for somebody who understands network topology. In other words, it's easier to train a clinical engineer into the IT protocols, as opposed to training an IT technician into a clinical technologies or biomedical role, because it's a completely different world. But The way I fell into this was that I started off, I worked, I was always a good technician. I mean, I was very much interested in tearing things apart and very much interested in learning how things work. So I got into that and then I got a summer job and doing electrical safety tests on medical devices at a hospital. And the company picked me up on a full-time basis after I graduated, and I never looked back. That's how I meant that I fell in backwards into it because I was never intended to do that. But it suited me very well once I got into it, and I progressed because I think the key thing that we need to do for progression is not the number of years you put into service or how much you make, but if there is a true interest, if there's true curiosity on how things work and how things are going, and how designs are moving forward in a different direction. And it's that sense of curiosity that I would really like to look for in an interview, not just on what's on the resume, but the sense of curiosity and how things work and how things can potentially evolve, and ability to manage those changes during those evolutionary processes.
So it sounds like this was the right path for you, right, Ramana? Or did you ever question if this was the right path for you? Did you ever question as far as was there something else that you would be interested in doing?
Well, I think that's what I'm looking at right now. I mean, I'm looking at other things I'm interested in doing. But the answer to your question, were there any times where I questioned if I were in the wrong field? At every single hospital I ever worked at, there have been those days when I did, yes. But overall, yes, I am satisfied with my career and what I've done and what I've accomplished. And and I expect that that'll continue one way or the other in whatever I do. I think the key common thing would be curiosity, knowing how something is working and how we can make it better.
So then to make it better, how do you see clinical technology now that you're not in it? You're retired now and living your best
Mhm.
life. How do you see clinical technology changing right now for anyone listening that is in clinical technology department?
So I would say not just clinical technologies, but healthcare management as well, because what's happening now is in the mad rush to level set budgets, what's happening is people are forgetting that there are certain functions outside of the simple biomed work. People, I think, when dollars become tight, they start to focus on, let's just keep the lights on, which is the basic biomed function of the preventative maintenance, inspection, safety, and performance verifications, etc. That is the minimum required for Joint Commission and any other regulatory agency. However, what needs to understand is you need to manage the totality of the medical technologies used at healthcare, because at the end of the day, healthcare institutions spend a tremendous amount of money in procuring that technology. And I think you just can't, after you spend the money, you just can't try to say, okay, I'll feed it the minimum amount of money in order to stay compliant. But I think that's not very cost effective in the long term. In the long term, the most cost effective way is providing clinical technologies to be a full service engineering provider. Case in point, if today in a group, if they're sort of going down to the simple biomed function, the break fix and the preventative maintenance, they wouldn't be able to do what we did once in one of the hospitals I worked at. Is that there was a patient that came into one of our ICUs that was a paraplegic. They had no motion or sensation below the neck. Actually, the only movement was his eyelids. So that individual, but then how do we, and then the nurses came to us and said, how can we give him access to the nurse call system? So we set up a little sensor that attached to the side of the temple that detected motions of the eyelids. So we were able to set up a certain pattern. So if they blink their eyes in a certain number of in a certain pattern, then that would trigger the alarm, that would trigger the nurse call. And that worked out great. Now that's an achievement for a full engineering department, but a simple biomed break fix shop will not be able to do that. And whether you spend that much money for that one instance, that's one instance. However, there day-to-day basis, there are so many different things that come up that require this type of engineering thought before to impact the patient safety and quality of life for our patients.
Okay. I had no idea about that actually. But as far as clinical technology, Ramana, I know it's ever changing. And one of my question is, you know how you brought up cybersecurity in the past and IT. Is there any future of joining forces when it comes to those departments, or are they two completely different department that it doesn't make sense?
There's a tremendous amount of collaboration. For example, the system engineering team that I talked about, they're joined at the hip with IT. So usually the biomeds, what they would do is they would take if they're troubleshooting something, the typical traditional modality is that once it goes to the wall, either power or network, it's not their problem. But and it becomes ITs, but or facilities. But we take it a step further.
Yes, understood. And IT is a whole other department. Thank you for explaining all of that. We're gonna wrap up this episode. Can you share your last words about clinical technology?
I think for anybody listening in, that not to fall prey to focusing on one of the basic functions of clinical technology, which is the biomedical engineering and break fix. Preventative maintenance, because there's a lot more to this. And since healthcare institutions spend a lot of money on technology, they need to be able to look at clinical technologies as a full engineering service department, as opposed to just a simple break fix device for medical devices.
Okay, that's great last words. And then if you were to describe your life journey in one word, what would it be?
Good. Life has been good.
Good. Okay. That's all that matters, right? Well, thank you, Ramana, for being on the podcast. If it's okay with you, if any of the audience listening have any questions in regards to clinical technology, or if they want to get in the field of that career path, is it okay if I leave your LinkedIn profile and they can message you for any questions?
Sure. Actually, that's one thing I've been delinquent in, because since I've been at this last place I worked at for 17 years, I never really updated my LinkedIn profile. So I don't really check it. I got to get into the habit of that. I think you'll be fine if you give them my email address as well.
Okay, perfect. I don't know, if anyone listening out there will contact you in regards to this, but you never know because we do have listeners from all over the country.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. My Gmail email is best way to get a hold of me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. And, hopefully we'll have more future episodes with you.
Definitely. I look forward to it.
Okay, Robina, have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Hi, everyone. Just a reminder, the content provided in our podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice. Listeners are encouraged to consult with appropriate professionals before making any business decisions based on the information provided in the podcast. We do not endorse any products or services mentioned unless stated in any of our episodes. Thank you for listening.